Welcome, everyone, to the PCI Practical Matters podcast, keeping you up to date on GovCon topics. Today, we are joined by Tyler Evans and Anna Menzel for part two of 3 areas to question traditional wisdom in government contracting. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Tyler.
Great, thanks, John. And so we're now on the second topic of 3 topics on these areas in which to question traditional wisdom in government contracting. Again, I'm Tyler Evans, a partner in the government contracts group at Steptoe, and I'm joined by Anna Menzel, an associate in the group as well. So Anna, for the second topic that we're talking about, we talked about commercial items last time and kind of what exactly do you have to do in terms of actual sales of commercial items, things like that. For this one, it's a little bit more nuanced. The general question that we're going to ask is, are vendors subcontractors? What's the deal when people say, well, this is a vendor, not a subcontractor? Are they the same thing? Could you give a little bit of background and thoughts about that?
Yeah, so the short answer is it depends. There are a number of considerations here that would make typical vendors not to be considered subcontractors, but there is no blanket exception for vendors. So let me provide just a little bit of background. So the first thing is that neither the FAR nor the DFARS actually define subcontract, which is a bit frustrating. Instead, they define it in particular subparts. So there are more than 24 definitions of subcontract. So for example, for purposes of the anti-kickback requirements, the FAR defines a subcontract as a contract entered into by a prime contractor for the purpose of obtaining supplies, materials, equipment, or services of any kind under a prime contract. So pretty broad definition. In contrast, the definition used for purposes of small business subcontracting focuses on the actual supplies or materials required for performance of the contract. So a little bit different definition there. And then we even get a different definition in FAR Part 12 for purposes of commercial product acquisition that focuses and even includes transfers of commercial items between divisions or subsidiaries. So we're getting a variety of different definitions in the FAR. But what makes it even more complicated is that occasionally the FAR will use the terms subcontractor or subcontract, but not include a definition in that subpart of the FAR. So that leaves contracting officers and contractors some discretion in how they determine what subcontractor means for purposes of that part. Moreover, the acquisition regulations are not even the only authority in this area. So for example, the OFCCP has an even broader definition of subcontract. The OFCCP defines subcontract for purposes of implementing, equal employment opportunity requirements, affirmative action requirements, as any agreement or arrangement between a contractor and any person which is necessary for the performance of any one or more contracts. And that necessary language is really important. So for example, in an older OFCCP case, the OFCCP determined that a railroad was even a subcontractor. So in that case, the railroad transported coal to a power plant, and the power plant subsequently contracted with GSA to supply electricity to certain federal facilities. And the government only used about 0.4% of electricity generated by this power plant. But notwithstanding that, even the railroad was found to be a subcontractor because they provided some of the coal that was required to produce the electricity that was subsequently transported to GSA. So it doesn't matter really whether the contribution to the government contract is large or small in the OFCCP's purview, as long as it is necessary to the performance of that federal contract. So depending on the circumstances and the requirements, a subcontractor could be any entity that is really quite attenuated from the actual performance of the prime contract, and potentially even an entity without knowledge of the prime contract if the required flowdowns aren't included. So in light of this ambiguity, there's kind of an ongoing debate about whether there even is a separate category of vendors or suppliers that are distinguishable from subcontractors. So just to put a slight caveat here, so what do we mean by vendor agreements? Generally, what we're talking about is agreements that are not directly supporting a prime contract. Typically, these could include, items or services procured to support a contractor's operations that are incidental to performance. So, parts or materials or services used in performance, but not actually incorporated into any deliverable. And so there are those that believe that there is a separate category of vendor or suppliers that are not subcontractors. And there's even some language in the FAR that could support this. So, for example, FAR Part 4, 1701 defines a subcontractor as a subcontract awarded by the prime contractor for purposes of acquiring supplies or services, but it does not include the contractor's supplier agreements with vendors. So there even is some language in the FAR that kind of confuses this topic even further. But turning it over to you, Tyler, do you think the current acquisition regulations exclude vendor agreements from the definition of subcontracts?
Yeah, and I think you laid it out well that the answer is, people could disagree, but no, right? There's no blanket exemption. But I do think what you kind of just walked through really helps kind of lay that out as to why that's the case. Because if you go through the 40 definitions or whatever it is in the FAR of the various components of subcontract that applies to this clause but not that clause, this part but not that part, you get kind of different categories of, well, is it spelled out in performance of the prime contract? Is it part of the statement of work or something like that? Might be one consideration. Or did you actually enter into the subcontract for performance of the prime contract, right? The purpose of what you're doing with the subcontractor, all the way down to the OFCCP. Kind of the way I always like to think about this, but I don't, generally tell clients this, is it's the whole, hole in the bottom of the sea, there's a frog on the log and the bump and that kind of song, right? It's kind of the coal was transported on the railroad, which went up to the power station, which then went down the power line to the base and provided 4.4% electricity, right? OFCCP has kind of a ridiculous position on a lot of that stuff. And so you do, a lot of people race to the bottom and do a common denominator and say, well, you just have to have that broad of a definition of subcontractor in order to comply. That's not necessarily the case, but I do think the other end of the spectrum, kind of well, if it relates to multiple contracts, or, we store our stuff, our commercial stuff and our government stuff at the same facility. So, that storage subcontractor is a vendor, or it's not a subcontractor, that kind of thing. I don't think there's any support for that authority, even though, a lot of people do take that position. That said, there's definitely movement in that direction, right? So you had the 2017 National Defense Authorization Act and the 2018 National Defense Authorization Act, two sections there, one for DoD and the rest, and the other for other agencies, essentially started trying to say, well, look, if an agreement is entered into by a contractor to supply what they called commodities, right? What does that mean? We don't know, right? But commodities that are intended for use in performance of a DoD or other agency contract and other commercial contracts, and is not identifiable with one of those, right? It's just a generic, we get storage in some way. It's not specified that we're doing it for this government contract, that kind of thing. There is a push, and there have been statutory provisions to try to create some kind of vendor-like exception, although it has a lot of qualifications, right? With commodities intended for performance, identifiable with particular contract, all sorts of terms that are in there that are not yet defined. But I will say that definition, right, has been there for 7 years now, something like that, and they still have not been able to implement it. It's very confusing to be able to implement this in a way that DoD and other agencies will feel comfortable with. And I think at a certain level, it's even Congress's fault, right? Because if you go to that language, it's a little bit ridiculous to me. They included this exclusion from subcontractors language, Congress did, in a statutory provision that said, these subcontracts are exempt from these areas of law. It's kind of that provision that says for commercial item subcontracts, here are the statutes that don't apply, maybe Anti-Kickback Act, things like that. And so if you think about it, honestly, when you read the clause, it's a double negative, right? It says this entire section says that none of these clauses apply to these types of commercial subcontracts. By the way, for this section, commercial subcontracts do not include these commodity, vendor, whatever things. And so that's been interpreted by DoD and others as a generic exemption for subcontracting, but Congress didn't do itself any favors, including it in that kind of provision for the commercial item subcontractors. So it's kind of we'll see. A lot of people want to move in that direction, but I think the answer for this topic is no, there is no blanket vendor exemption for subcontractors. Absolutely, what some companies consider vendors could still be considered a subcontractor, depending on the clause, depending on the relationship, all of that.
Thank you, everyone, for joining the PCI Practical Matters podcast. We hope to see you again soon.